I'm delighted to participate in this collective intelligence event, and I would say, like Ezra Zuckerman mentioned earlier, I was trained as a sociologist, but I'm coming to see myself as a collective intelligence researcher. Last summer at Carnegie Mellon, I was invited to speak at this group, and I realized that this is the group. This may be my tribe, my new tribe. So I'm going to talk to, I would say, I think of myself probably less of a collective intelligence researcher and more of a collective ignorance researcher. And so I think that provides pathways to collective intelligence. So I'm going to talk about designing diversity for collective advance and how to think about principles that might allow us to do that. As I mentioned, I'm a sociologist and computational social scientist. I'm let's see if I'm having a hard time advancing my slides here. Here we go. I run a computational social science program at the University of Chicago and a center called Knowledge Lab, which is really focused on using large-scale data, machine learning, and intelligent crowdsourcing, following Jeff Howe's lead, to enable us to kind of represent, understand, which is to say do kind of a large-scale science studies and transform how it is that we generate new knowledge. And the underlying question is, how does science and discovery as a system think, and how can we rewire it to think better, to do the various things that it might claim that it wants to do better. And so I've been trying to ferment some of these discussions at places like Science of the last couple of years, where we've focused on building up the community of the science of science. A lot of it has to do there with really diagnosing collective intelligence and identifying how it is that we could identify opportunities for collective advance. So I'm going to share a few recent research insights and some musings in the context of three kind of empirical chapters. One is how diverse and disconnected communities generate more robust scientific insights, how novel collective inference gets driven by cross-disciplinary expeditions, by people who are diverse as a function of their disciplinary and perspectival backgrounds, and then how designing diversity can accelerate not only discoveries that might have already been on the future, but to also chart an inhuman future, which is to say to identify discoveries that would not have been made otherwise. And so underlying this is a view of science and innovation and technological development as a complex system, which kind of underlies the fact that humans act often as pack animals, such that they create dense social connections that can distort collective certainty and slow novel discovery and invention. So a couple of simple demonstrations of this is, if you look at the social structure of agreement or disagreement in peer review, recently we looked at this in the context of PLOS One. These are reviews in the neuroscience space, and we found that they were highly clustered epistemologies, which is to say, if you were connected to an author, or to the author of an author, or the co-author of the co-author of the co-author, however close that connection was, predicted the likelihood that you would accept versus reject the piece that you were reviewing. And again, this was further than just tit for tat, and you doing them a favor and them doing you a favor. These were sometimes 2 or 3 or 4 connections away from yourself. There's no obvious way in which you could anticipate a benefit to yourself, and yet nevertheless, you found their work accurate enough to not reject it from PLOS One, whose only ostensible criteria for evaluation is accuracy and not the significance of a finding. Related to this is more recent work that we've done to identify how centralized communities generate less replicable results in the context of what many have called the replication crisis. And the social and behavioral sciences, also in genetics and medicine. Initially, we looked at this in drug-gene interactions, where we took basically findings from the literature and we lined them up with high throughput results from a massively replicated, kind of robotically driven lab experiment on drug-gene interactions. And on the one hand, we found that there was collective correction in science, where there were a ton of people publishing about things. It was more likely that one was to find deep replication in the context of a high throughput experiment. And similarly, in converse, when there was disagreement over the conditions in which a drug might be efficacious for a disease-related gene, you also found disagreement in the literature, right? So there was kind of an alignment between the high throughput experiment and between what it is that scientists and the community were actually doing. But when there was a high level of centralization in science, scientists in the community, and when there was a high level of dependence or overlap, for example, between authors on the papers that were contributing to that particular drug gene-related claim, or they were using the same methods, or they were citing the same prior work and having the same orientation that was leading them to anticipate the same findings, that they were much more likely to agree with themselves over time, that all those things were like a methodological or a kind of epistemological bubble. You know, so the same co-authors use the same methods, rely on the same prior literature, and that this is associated with less replicable findings in the context of massively replicated high throughput experiments, which is to say, you know, individuals, if they're all tied together using all the same methods with all the same expectations, are performing the same precise experiment over and over and over again, which is very unlikely to generalize outside their labs into the clinic, into medicine, into areas that are beyond their particular area. Whereas findings which are distributed across the community have diverse authors, diverse methods, draw on diverse background knowledge, end up doing precisely the opposite. And we find the same thing in recent work on clinical trials. This is associated with, as fields grow in science, there's a shrinkage in the amount of prior work that is drawn upon. And that shrinkage in the prior work increases not only the actual advances, but the illusion of advances. Finally, we see that flocking ends up slowing the advance towards future understanding, because individuals are less likely to span out across the space of possible discoveries. And in most recent work on this kind of first chapter of Insight, we found that when we looked at gene-gene interactions, you know, publications versus high throughput experiments, we can basically take these biases and use them to generate greater certainty. So for example, we can take the dependence between communities, and we can use those dependencies to generate predictions. These are AUCs, just based on the insularity of the communities, that allows us to make better overall assessments, kind of Bayesian updates of the literature in general. And when we take this into account, we find, for example, massive increases in our ability to predict the robustness of a finding as a result of the number of distinct communities and our ability to kind of span out across the space of possible things examined. In general, this suggests that these connected communities end up weakening the results and generalization of those communities. So chapter 2 in this exploration is, you know, that robust facts are established across clusters, as we just talked about, but novel discoveries actually occur across fields, right? So this goes back to a broader question that I began with: how does science as a collective think? Well, do they think by deducing from existing known kind of facts or commitments or axioms to the future, like Aristotle would propose, or like Francis Bacon would suggest, by induction, by imaginatively generalizing from observations? Well, in collectivities, we do both of those things. And in fact, Charles Sanders Peirce argued that almost every recent advance in science, technology, and business is the result of the creative production of hypotheses based on the collision of induction and deduction. So the creation of new surprising or new hypotheses is a function of surprising or theory-defying evidence. And we find strong evidence for this in our own investigations of the scientific and technological space. So when we look at at papers in biomedicine and physics and even inventions. And we build a model, we build a kind of a manifold that, that draws together the things that are the most likely to come together in the context of a current discovery. And when we do this across all fields and try to predict all of next year's papers, we're able to predict about 98% of basically the collections of keywords, you know, the methods, the problems that are combined in the context of next year's papers. And that's because, you know, researchers are persistent in these spaces. And it also suggests, what this also suggests are the papers that show up that are unlikely to be expected under this most expected or most predictable model. And it turns out if we analyze these unexpected discoveries are highly likely to be associated with major awards. So we're able to predict, you know, almost, 50 to 60% of the likelihood of being in the top 10% of citations as a result of this novelty, novel combinations of elements in this space in biomedicine and physics and patents. And the thing that's most interesting is when we ask where these come from. Did they come from unusual people? No, not an average. Did they come from unusual teams? No. What they come from is unusual expeditions. So they come from people with a certain set of expertise to travel over to a new audience, to publish in a journal that's never seen people like them before, and no people like them has published on problems like this before. So it's really, this comes, new discoveries in this space come from conversation between established fields and outsiders or aliens. So it's this conversation between insiders who identify familiar puzzles and outsiders that kind of address or solve those problems with alien patterns. So the next question I pose is how, can we actually use these principles to design diversity that increases collective imagination and accelerates advance? And so we tried to do this in the context of a really interesting Nature paper from last summer that we didn't write, that was written by researchers at Lawrence Livermore Lab in Berkeley, where they used artificial intelligence methods to embed and then predict new photovoltaic or thermoelectric materials. And so they were able to develop predictions that had a 40% precision or hit rate, where they were able to predict new materials, the next 40%, the next 20 years of materials that were discovered with those particular properties. And so we thought, well, can we do better by understanding what the field itself is likely to discover? And so we built random walks over this space. We did a precise replication of their work, and then we built random walks over the space that jump not only from chemical to chemical, but also through authors. So our random walks were able to identify social communities, and those random walks are very unlikely to jump across a boundary between those communities, because there's no person sitting at the boundary of those communities to make an inference. If we do that, then we're able to double those predictions. So we jump from a 40% precision in predicting new materials over the next 20 years to an 85% prediction in predicting new materials that will have thermoelectric properties, ferroelectric properties, over 90% prediction in predicting things that would have photovoltaic properties. And what's the most interesting is that we can capture the most expected discoveries and the most unexpected discoveries. So the ones that are random walks in this space identify that are the most likely to be inferred by actual people are the ones that are discovered in the first few years. And then we're able to identify things that will be very unlikely to be discovered by the scientific system as it currently stands, with educations the way they are and boundaries between fields. In fact, we're able to further predict the discovering teams, who are the actual people who are likely to cross the boundaries and make particular discoveries, and use those to catalyze implausible discoveries by suggesting teams that would be likely to identify new things. We've been porting this recently to drug gene vaccine prediction, where we found that the vaccines which are currently under clinical trial review are those that would be most expected by the scientific system to be considered at this time. But the ones that haven't been considered that are equally promising, the reason they haven't been considered is because basically the scientific system is structured in a certain way. And if we identify and catalyze diversity by focusing attention on certain places where no persons currently exist, then we could really explore new parts of the space which would be critical for public health. So just in conclusion, I'm proposing that we can really think about designing diversity to catalyze advance. That discovery is fundamentally a high-dimensional phenomenon that requires social, institutional, and methodological disconnection and diversity. That novel combinations of people, techniques, and problems advance the space, and that designing optimal diversity can catalyze future advance that wouldn't have occurred otherwise. Moreover, it suggests that to generate robust insight and rapidly advanced technology and science, that we can actually design diverse intelligences by adding artificial intelligences that don't think the way in which the human crowd has trained them. And so it really actually, I think, proposes a new way of thinking, a collective intelligence way of thinking about AIs, a new artificial intelligence that augments human intelligence by actually being complementary to it, by being very different from it. And so I'll close with that and just a mention of my collaborators on these various projects. And with that, I'll end. Thank you.